Hello and welcome to the Placemaking Book Club here on iProperty Radio with myself, Carol Tallon. Today I'm joining you from Maynooth University with Rob Kitchin, Professor of Geography. Rob, thank you so much for letting us into the university. It's always good to visit Maynooth University because it is growing at a scale that I can barely understand in the last 20 years. So you might just give us a little bit of background about your role here and what the university is doing.
Yeah, so I joined Maynooth in 1998. It's been here quite a while now. It's grown a lot since I've been here. I think from probably about 3,700 students to over 15,000 now. And it's just expanded across all the subjects really, and taken on new subjects, traditionally quite traditional subjects. So, and really just the three faculties. So arts, humanities, social sciences, science and electronic engineering. So we don't really have medicine, we're starting nursing and sports science and so on, but we're really a kind of a liberal arts university traditionally.
Very good. And I was here myself only a couple of weeks ago attending a really interesting session on how the work that Maynooth University, but also that other academic bodies are doing in terms of compiling data that is actually feeding and informing policy making. Yep. So, and again, this is the Placemaking Book Club, so we are going to talk about books, but with you, it was difficult to know where to start because I'm familiar with about 8 of your books, and then I learned today that you have written or contributed to up to 37 academic books. Yep. So you might just kind of give us a run through of your field of academic interest.
Yeah, so I'm a geographer by training, and I'm generally interested in things around place, space, nature, environment, landscape, mobility, those kind of geographical kinds of concepts. And most of my work really focuses on what the digital is doing in relation to society and space. So whether that's around kind of smart cities kind of work, or whether it's around kind of planning and development kind of work, I'm kind of interested in how the digital and digital data is mediating what's kind of going on in not just in relation to cities, but in relation to how we manage and govern places in general.
That is so broad. I might just ask you to explain maybe in a property context, because our audience is very much operating across the built environment, and so whether they're touching off academia or policy making, most would be involved in the industry in some context. You might just explain the work that you're doing in terms of collecting data has some wide-reaching impacts that maybe the industry isn't aware that it has been benefiting from.
So we'd have been feeding into the idea of evidence-informed policy probably from the late 1990s, and I inherited some work that was already going on. Professor Jim Walsh here had been doing a lot of the kind of the mapping work for the National Spatial Strategy and some rural strategies before then. So we were really trying to push the line about using evidence as a means to understand what was going on, and then to try and do some kind of long-term planning, but also to monitor whether what was being implemented was actually making the difference that we anticipated it would be. So then in 2005, we set up a unit called the All Ireland Research Observatory, so AIRO, and we were doing a lot of work at that time mainly on cross-border, linked to another body which we were involved in called the International Centre for Local Regional Development, which is again cross-border. So it was kind of linking ourselves with the University of Ulster Centre for Cross-Border Studies, Queen's University, and so on. And what we were trying to do was work out, could we create all Ireland data sets, so we could work out, so if we were, it's kind of, I guess, in the kind of the in the aftermath of the peace process, how do you get planners on either side of the border who'd never spoken to each other previously? It was back-to-back planning, even though they might be managing the same watersheds or same environment and so on. So on one side, we were organising all these workshops, bringing the planners into the room with each other to get conversations. On the other side, we were trying to assemble data sets that they could use and create data tools So kind of interactive dashboards, if you like, and interactive mapping systems. Now that wasn't straightforward at all because the data in the north and the data in the south are actually quite different. So even if you took something like the census, there's only about 30% of the questions that match. You can get about 35% of the others to match if you do a lot of fiddling around with them, disaggregation, reaggregation, and so on. And then 35% don't match at all because there's no equivalent question. And so we were trying to provide an evidence base really that would help guide these kind of cross-border conversations about shared economy, shared planning, shared resources, all that kind of stuff. And then we did, after that, we did a lot of work with local authorities, some of the regional authorities, most of the government departments.
Apologies, but just before you move into there, for somebody who is not an expert in data, I'm kind of struck by, you mentioned there that the census data in the Republic of Ireland versus Northern Ireland, only kind of a 30% overlap.
Yeah.
In what way? As in, does that mean that as a nation, were we asking the right questions? Are we asking the right questions now to understand how to cater to the needs
they were always back
of
to
citizens?
back. So the Northern Ireland census aligns with the rest of the UK census. So they have to be comparable with, they have to produce data that will match with England, Wales, Scotland, right?
Right.
Whereas in the Republic, we developed our own. Now, obviously, the census prior to independence was part of the same system. And so some of those legacy questions will match, but then over time we've changed some of our census questions around policy options that we want information on. So the census doesn't stay stable the entire time. There's always a little bit of change. Some questions come off, some come on. And also we tweak the question. Now the big difference between, say, like the North and the South is like we might use, say, like the International Labour Organization's category of jobs, and they might use a different one. Okay. So the categories and classes are different, which means when you wanted to make a comparison, they're not always like for like. So that's the kind of 35% that you can fiddle around with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. But in terms of
all the basic demographic ones you can match.
Needs of citizens.
Yeah. So, but that was like up until like the peace process happened. Like they were back-to-back planning. There was very little collaboration. When they did the regional development strategy in the late 1990s, and we did the national spatial strategy here, there was pretty much no conversation going on between the two. That's why when you take the maps from the regional development strategy and you link on the national spatial, the roads come out in different places and the things come out in different, like they were prepared separately. It's back-to-back planning. Okay, so what we were trying to do was kind of say, look, if we are serious about a shared economy and shared, then we need some data that matches up, that we can, whether that's on tourism or economy or health or welfare or labour stuff or economy stuff, whatever, like transport, whatever. But for most of the data sets that we looked at, it was very, very difficult to match any of them. And even now, it's still difficult to match. We also we weren't georeferencing our data in the south.
Okay.
And they also collect into different units, so they were kind of using wards and whatever, output areas and wards, and we were using DEDs, and so even the scale of the data made it difficult to match up, and we were trying to find solutions to those kinds of problems. Now they all have implications to things like planning and development, because whether you're a company and you want to look at what's going on to plan how you might invest into certain places and so on, or if you're a government and you want to understand how you're going to do your local area plan or your county development plan and take into account your neighbours, and if you're a border county, that was very difficult to do, and we were trying to find solutions that would help fix that problem.
Where are we in terms of data collection as a country? Because I mentioned to you before we started recording that I wrote my first book on the property market before we had the National Property Price Register. Yeah. So actually back then valuations, while they were based on this comparative model, the comparative was somebody in one agency picked up the phone to somebody in another agency and asked, what price did that property go for, what lease, what was the value? Well, there's a little more transparency, surely.
No, they
and
still do
accountability.
that. So like say if you were interested in like commercial vacancy and so on, the 6 big real estate companies meet every quarter, I think it is, and they swap their data, which I always thought was kind of interesting. I thought that they would be very competitive advantage and hold their data and not share it. But they've realised that none of them have enough view of the market that they have to share the data. Now, there's some things they won't share and there's some things they will share. And they will ring each other up and ask about prices down the road or whatever. But they do collaborate on that. On say, compiling commercial vacancy, they do meet and compile their data. Now, it doesn't go to the rest of us. Yeah. Like it's a product you'd have to buy. It's not, and actually that's a big blind spot in the state's data. Like what the state collects is primarily residential. Mm-hmm. We have no data on retail. We have no data on industry. We have no data on infrastructure. We have no data on offices. The state doesn't collect any of that data.
But why is that? Is that just reflective of where the country is in its data journey, or is it more a signal of priorities?
I think it's partly a signal of priorities, but it's also partly that's been left to industry, that the real estate agents are best placed to have that data and to gather that data and to publish it. But what that does mean is we don't have independent data around that. Now that's really problematic around things like doing your local area plans and your county development plans, because if you don't know retail vacancy levels and you're planning to put a new shopping centre into somewhere, you'd like to know that, right? You'd like to know that 20% of units are vacant, so why are we building X 100,000 square metres or more space? Like, is that a logical thing to do? But that part of the evidence is kind of missing because it's not publicly available data. It's if we have it, it's privately held data. And generally our data ecosystem is quite patchy and partial. And
will you take a moment to explain that? Because I know I do want to get on to some of the concepts in this book and others. But when you talk about the data ecosystem for the built environment, that's critically important at the moment. With the conversation we're having in terms of today, as you and I are meeting, we're only a couple of weeks after finding out that the projections of what we thought would be the provided housing or delivered housing in 2024 was out by about 25%, which is pretty shocking. We're still having conversations around dezoning land. There's, even though we are getting somewhat better in terms of trying to understand where the needs for housing are, there's still a complete disconnect. So explain to me, in the context of the built environment, what does the data ecosystem look like?
So typically it's very fractured, and it is in every country because there are different people responsible for different. So we've mapped out that ecosystem, if you like, of and this is what my current project is doing, is trying to understand the housing data ecosystem in its entirety. So we've been looking, so we've spoken to well over 90 different organisations now, a very large number who are producing data. So there's a whole set of state bodies. So whether it's like Valuation Office or Rental Tenancies Board or Property Registration Authority or whatever, like there's a load of them, right?
But are you talking just state agencies, or are you
no.
with industry as well?
So we've also mapped out industry, and we've gone and spoken to like the real estate agents. We've gone and spoken to some of the data analytics companies, some of the professional organisations, and so on. Then there's a civil society. So your Threshold, your Focus Ireland, your Simon Community, all of those kinds of organisations, plus some others, right? So all of them, to some degree, are generating some data, and we've been doing data audits. We've done about 38 data audits now, trying to work out who is holding what, whether it's open, whether it's closed, whether it's shared or not. Right down to the kind of variable level. So what specific bits of data. Now, so that's why it's fragmented, is because it's across lots of different organisations and it's not pulled together. So we have no central data hub where all of this data is pulled into and is is kind of cleaned up, wrangled, reorganised so that it can talk to each other.
Whose role would that be? That sounds like a governmental state agency role.
Yeah, you would. Now, where it should sit is a question, right? I'm a bit wary of saying it should sit in the Department of Housing, because it's a bit like disclosure data. It's data that's about them, like, and their performance.
Well, they would take the view, the Housing Department would take the view that the Housing for All dashboard contains all of the relevant information required to make decisions.
Yeah, but that's simply not the case, right? I don't think anybody working in the industry would be of that view, because it's so broad, right? You know, whether it's, complete, if you just think like the pipeline, the construction pipeline, so you've got your planning and your construction, then you've got like social housing, rental, you've got specialist stuff like nursing home, student accommodation, refugee accommodation, all that kind of stuff. You've got stuff around stock, you've got stuff around demographics, who's actually living in them. You've got stuff around housing finance, you've got stuff around market activity.
I'm thinking infrastructure utilities.
Yeah, infrastructure utilities. So there's lots of components to this housing landscape that at the minute, if you're working in it, it's quite hard work to identify who has what data, whether you can get access to it, and then to know the veracity around the data. So what's its quality? It's quite difficult sometimes to get metadata, difficult to get methodological transparency, which is what basically, how is it collected? So one, it's hard to sometimes find the data, and then secondly, like the degree to which you can have confidence and trust in the data is also a little bit of a question. And we have a history, and it's also very changeable. So some of our data doesn't go back very far, and some of it can kind of shift quite quickly. Like we changed the methodology quite quickly, and so on.
But is part of the problem actually that some of it doesn't change quick enough? So, for example, maybe out of date CSO data informing planning policies locally.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the CSO, the census data is only every 5 years, and so there's always conditions around the data, right? So you'll have conditions around just the attribute coverage, so what is collected. Then you'll have conditions around the spatial coverage, and for me, most of the data is at the wrong spatial scale. A lot of our data, say like planning data, is published at county level. We need it at a minimum at town level. Like say like Cork or Galway, a huge county, to have a single figure representing the whole county when we're trying to plan and manage around towns and settlements is not that helpful. We need to know what's going on with planning in relation to particular at a lower spatial scale.
Do local authorities, they would surely have that information?
No, see, that is why the census has become so valuable, is because it's one of the few data sets that really does go sub-county. In fact, it goes down to small area level, 80 to 100 households. There are very few other data sets that get down to that kind of granularity. You can get some of the planning data if out of the planning permissions stuff, or out of BCMS, or some of the data in the valuation office is at building level, but there's very little at building level that's publicly, openly accessible data that you don't necessarily have to do a lot of wrangling. You could just use off the shelf. Like if you're going to use the BCMS database, for example, you'd have to be prepared to do a lot of cleaning, take out duplicates, clean up the database to be able to use it, and so on. So that's, and then the other issue around coverage would be the temporal bit, which is like, is it timely enough? Should it be monthly? Should it be quarterly? Should it be yearly? Now, 5 years. So the benefit of the census is we have a lot of granularity in the data. It's a fantastic data set, but it takes so much effort to compile it. You can only do it every 5 years. You wouldn't be able to do it every year. Now what the CSO are looking at is to move towards an administrative census. So 2031 is probably they're going to run an administrative census and the census together.
Can you explain the difference?
So basically they'll try and use existing government databases that are used to manage, say, within revenue, within welfare, within housing, within whatever. Can you answer the census questions using those administrative data sets as opposed to going and knocking on people's doors? So they're going to run the two together and then see what the match on the results is. Now, if the match is really great, in theory, you could run that every year, which might be a big shift. Now, whether they would do it at the spatial scale that we would like is a different is a different kind of question, right? So I'm interested in trying to provide evidence that will help people make informed decisions, whether that's the state, whether that's business, whether that's civil society. Like, I don't mind, right? But I just think that we need to have a decent bank of evidence that we can have confidence in, that will inform us in a way that minimises uncertainty and risk, basically.
Yeah, and but also leads to the right outcomes, and in a sense that can be used perhaps to not just help the industry respond to needs today, but actually more accurately forecast not just needs in terms of pure numbers, but actually how those numbers are broken down and where those numbers are broken down. And that's one of the things that I was very keen to talk to you about today, because I want industry to, I suppose, understand a little more how the work that academia is doing here, and actually how that can be contributed to in a way that informs policy, that actually facilitates better outcomes. And I'm not sure that the link is very, very well known outside of academic circles.
Yeah, so and we would have, over a long period of time, links with bits of industry, whether it's working with software providers or whether it's working with industry companies. It's mainly, say, for example, the National Centre for Geocomputation, which is down the corridor from us. They would do a lot of work with industry. So they have a big project at the minute called Terrain AI, which is doing a lot of kind of real-time mobile mapping, working with Microsoft, working with drone companies, working with Irish data companies, data analytics companies. And so it's a big consortium, also across university and so on. And it's all about trying to develop new concepts, new ideas, new tools, solve technical problems, answer social questions, and so on. Right. So there's a kind of a co-sharing, and there will be some government partners in there as well. On our side, we're typically more dealing with the state. Now, on our current project, we have been talking to the real estate companies. We've been talking to these data analytics companies, and we've been doing interviews with them. We have done a year-long collaboration with a planning company around their data services. And actually, that's one of the roles where some of these data analytic companies are playing, where they're taking state data. Typically, they're taking state data, they're cleaning it up, they're sorting it out, they're adding value to it, they're standardizing it, they're validating it, and then they're selling it on. In some cases, they might be selling it back to the state through consultants. It might be consultancy as opposed to just the data, or they might be selling it on to other actors like developers, builders, architects, planning consultancies, retail companies who want to try and work out where they're going to put their next store, whatever that might be. And there's a bunch of companies who are doing that kind of work. They might also be taking other private data. So they might be taking retail data, they might be taking insurance, banking data. They might be working with those companies where they get an agreement to link or share across companies. So there's almost like a little data trust amongst a small group of companies that they'll share data to be able to get insights that they wouldn't be able to get just from their own data.
Are we missing part of the equation if we don't take that data and be able to present it in a way that companies can use and rely on, that the community can use and rely on? So yes, feeding into policy, but also, one of the projects I'm very interested in that you're involved in is around data stories. So what's the kind of driver behind that? Is it a kind of quest to be understood, or to try, it's not even a question of relevance, but actually showing how the data directly impacts people?
Yeah, so what the Data Storage Project is, it kind of has two themes. On the one side, we're trying to tell stories about the data. So these stories around how it's produced, how it's shared, issues around the quality, issues around gaps and all that kind of stuff. And then and how it's used and how it's deployed and so on. So the full data lifecycle, if you like, and its use. And then the second side is really telling stories with that data. So we kind of have our own mini digital twin. We have a 3D model of the city. We have a 3D printed model of the city, which we can cast the data onto. We're also working with 7 artists.
Just on that point, I just had the opportunity to see it there, and we will try to put in some video footage of that, because actually it's a great way, it really does demonstrate telling the story, showing the data as opposed to talking about the data. So I'll certainly include a link there for people to see, or if you're listening on podcast, I recommend going over to YouTube and we'll have a link to that.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to do there is tell stories with the data, and try and get a conversation about, well, what kind of stories does this data let us tell, and what doesn't it let us tell? Because it's, the data either doesn't enable us to answer certain questions because it's either, it's unsuitable, or it's missing, or it's a proxy, or whatever. So the stories that I've been working on, I've been working on a whole load of them. So I write a short story every week based on one of the things I've been kind of encountering. But I've also just been working on a set of data debates. So this is one of the kind of things that tells us that there are some issues with our data. And there's a whole bunch of these data debates in Ireland. So you'll be familiar with all of them. Vacancy, so there's lots of contests around vacancy, how you measure vacancy, what the vacancy is telling us, and so on. Completions, again, ongoing for at least 10 years of newspaper stories about challenges around how we count houses are finished and so on. Commencements, dereliction.
Please tell me the rental market, because
rental
I
market,
spend
so landlords
most of my time
versus
trying to understand. Every agency report will document an exodus of landlords leaving the market, and yet
the census shows the opposite.
Well, the RTB data, which, to be fair, the RTB team themselves have come out and said, well, we are correcting in terms of a previous 2 decades of maybe under registrations, but it's very difficult to understand.
Another one. Yeah. So and then things like housing targets, where they're estimated data. So we need 25,000 up to 80, 90,000, depending on who you talk to, houses per year. So that's housing estimate data, and so model data or predictive forecast data, simulated data, whatever. So we have a whole series of these debates. Now, if we had really good, high quality data, those debates would still be there, because people will still kind of say, I prefer this than this, but they wouldn't exist in the same way that they do. Now, those debates go on everywhere. So number of homeless, number of hidden homeless, there's loads of them, right? It doesn't matter what sector, it doesn't matter what part of the housing thing, they have them. They have them in other countries as well. It's not a uniquely Irish thing. But
there's an element of perspective here as well, because I've been in this industry for almost 25 years, and only in the last few weeks, because of work through MEP Kieran Mullooly, I discovered that actually people who are in refuges, particularly predominantly women and children, they're not counted among the homeless figures, even though they're there in a temporary capacity while they are looking for something more permanent.
Asylum seekers aren't either. Asylum seekers aren't either.
So I can understand around the data, and I suppose my reason for sitting down with you today and trying to understand and trying to reconcile some of this is, I want to see.
Well, we are getting a lot better at it. I will say
and
that.
I can genuinely see that. But we also need that data to contribute to places and spaces that actually serve the needs of their community. And that brings us to the 3rd edition of Key Thinkers on Space and Place. You might just tell us, and I know that we don't have a huge amount of time, but I think this is really interesting. First of all, tell me why you felt there was a need for a 3rd edition, first of all. And I know that the ambition for this predated COVID, although the execution was a little after.
COVID kind of broke the, lots of people got distracted, was too busy and so on. So it took a while to get the book together. So the first So the idea here basically is there are key concepts within different disciplines. So space and place are kind of key concepts within geography, but they also appear in, anthropology, sociology, economics, politics, and so on. So not all of the people in there are geographers. They're from a number of different disciplines. There's development studies and a few others. But they all think about the same concept differently.
Right,
So
but there isn't even consensus as to what is place and what is space.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That was the first thing that tripped me up.
Yeah.
Can you maybe explain that a
Yeah,
little?
so some people would say space is basically the abstract plane in which we kind of exist, and place is a sense of community and belonging and identity with a location. That's kind of...
Well, I would agree with that school of thought because it feeds into the work that we can more neatly put in the bucket of placemaking.
Yeah.
But truthfully, I hadn't thought about it before.
But that's
being
kind of
challenged.
the opposite ends of kind of what we were talking about before we started the recording, right?
Yeah.
So your GIS system is treating this as a space. It's a relatively abstract mapping system.
Yeah.
You put in your data. There's no people in there, really. The people are there in an abstract way.
Where does
whereas
the
place
natural geography overlap with human geography?
Sorry?
Where does the natural geography overlap with human geography?
Yeah, I'll come to that first. I better just explain the place thing. The place thing, where you were talking about it before, around, say, planning and development, is much more around values, beliefs, opinions, feelings, and a sense of community or belonging around a location. Now, that's quite different to what's in a GIS. And what's happening with some of that digital technology around these kind of consultative platforms is they're linking the two together, and you're allowing kind of notions of place to, so you can interact, you can click on a point on a thing and a bit of an interview will pop up, or a bit of a narrative, or a bit of... So the data, quantitative and qualitative data, are kind of getting merged together a little bit within some of those
Our
kind of
platform
planning.
is guilty of that.
Yeah, so that's a different thing to how it would have been when we did the first edition of that book, like 20 whatever years ago, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think the thing there is in the book is sorry, to go back to your initial point then about the environment, physical geography, human geography. I mean they interlink it over the notion of environment and nature, really, and how people interact with those. So, all the stuff around climate change, for example, is both physical and human geography, right? Some of it's kind of human mitigation and so on, and some of it's the physical processes of how things are changing in terms of ecosystems and how, the climate system works, physical systems work and so on. So they kind of interlink in that. Now, there are no physical geographers included in that book, because often they don't really philosophize around. They take it for granted that there's this thing called space and that's it.
Yeah.
And there might be some differences in opinion around that, and there is now an emerging area of like critical physical geography, which is trying to take is not so wedded fully into the scientific method and will take account of more kind of human ways of thinking and being and doing and so on. But generally speaking, they would take the scientific method as the way in which they do their research and the way and the lens through which they see the world. Whereas these people are taking very different views. So in here, you'll have people who are, phenomenologists, or, so they would take like humanistic kinds of approaches.
That was a concept I wasn't familiar with until I read some of these.
So they might be a post-structuralist, or they could be a structuralist, which is maybe more Marxist kind of political economy kinds of thinking. So there are different kind of philosophical schools across the social sciences and humanities, and depending on how you see the world, your world view through those philosophical lens, you will understand space and place differently.
Yeah, and
that's basically what those thinkers are doing.
Yeah. I actually, it's something I will include a link with our show notes, because there was many concepts here that I wasn't familiar with at all. But despite decades in the industry, I'm a recent master's graduate in planning, so actually I'm quite new to this geography, to this approach. And actually, what I've noticed just from reading these is that there's linked with other academic papers that I've read, is that there seems to be themes that emerge through institutions or through universities. So you've lecturers in the same university that might appear to be publishing along the same leaning. And so actually it's almost like not comparing research, but almost like comparing institutions in terms of a leaning. And there was one thing I wanted to ask you about.
I see it more as kind of, there are probably more kind of schools of thought. Now they might be linked, they might have originated maybe in certain places, but they certainly, they normally go well beyond and they link together. And often they're through networks actually.
Okay.
So a lot of the stuff around finance geography is all linked into this financial geography network, who are all global, but they're all very well networked and know each other and are swapping. So it's a network thing rather than a single institution thing.
Well, that would make more sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Over the course of a career.
Yeah, and so they would develop a certain kind of lens through which they would understand finance. Now, some of it will be linked into disciplines. So how an anthropologist thinks about place might be different to how a sociologist or how a political scientist or how a development studies person understands place.
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked, and it's something that I've struggled with, and I struggle with every time I return to academic learning, which is every couple of years, and that is the almost lack of what I would call an opinion pushing things forward, because that's not what the papers, that's not what the research is designed to do. But actually, in the essay introducing this third edition, there is a reference there to how recent years have witnessed Anglo-American geography grappling with a range of complex, wicked problems. So climate change, environmental racism, housing crises, and how what are referred to as wicked problems, which is an emotive enough word to see in an academic book, but how these demand new conceptual frameworks and new ways of approaching space. And that's
but a wicked problem would be a very well-known social science concept in that it's a problem that's just really, really difficult to solve because the things are so interlinked and entwined that you think there might be a simple solution. We'll pull this lever and this thing will get fixed. But actually you pull this lever and two things pop out over there. This thing partially gets fixed, but actually doesn't, because you get these unanticipated things happen. You know, so unanticipated consequences of pulling the lever that you don't expect to happen and then does happen.
Is that because the interconnectedness
throughout? And because it's so intractable, a lot of the problems are so intractable, and there is actually no simple solution. So it's a wicked problem in that there is no simple, like, we can just fix this solution, and you don't necessarily know the consequences of pulling that lever. Like you can try and predict it and so on, but actually you don't know until it happens. And you can make the problem worse, or you can make the problem better but different. So you create a new problem, or so you think you've fixed this problem and suddenly you got this problem, and we get that in housing, I think, all the time, right? You kind of do this and then suddenly, oh Jesus, what, rents are doing this now, or homeless rates are doing this now, and we thought that would fix the problem and it hasn't. It's actually, and it might have alleviated some of that, but it's now led to this over here as well.
The law of unintended consequences, for sure.
And certainly other things can come along that just disrupt things completely, like 100,000 Ukrainians turn up, right? Yeah. And that's completely
or COVID, indeed.
Or COVID.
War in Europe.
Yeah, whatever it is, energy crisis, whatever it is.
When we
this is the problem with the social, you see.
Yeah.
The problem with the social is it's always emergent. It's not like physics where the law of gravity is going to stay like the same. Like, this is a totally emergent system that's constantly changing. It's like, just as you start to get your head around, something else comes along that disrupts it all. I'm sure if we were in America now, we might be having a conversation about how Trump is just disrupting the entire federal system, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's...
I think we probably need to be having that conversation in Ireland as well.
But that would be very difficult. Like, so people will say, "Oh, the social sciences have failed." Blah blah blah. It's like, no, the social sciences are trying to deal with wicked problems and things that change really quickly. Like, this is like one level, we've had a housing crisis in Ireland for at least 100 years, right? It just keeps. It's just the nature of the crisis keeps altering.
And I know Ronan Lyons has also done some research into historical. So he would have essentially said pretty much the same in terms of trying to trace back the origin of the crisis, kind of which crisis, or is it all part of the same? Rob, I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time with you, and I know that you have students lining up outside the door. So I suppose final question, just because of the work that you've been doing, the stellar work that you've been doing, and how that's been feeding in. We've touched there on the law of unintended consequence, and that's something we talk about probably in a more flippant way, particularly around housing policy, but it's generally used when we describe ad hoc or reactive policy. So in your experience, is it more foreseeable, are the consequences more foreseeable if we can lean more on the data to inform those policies as opposed to being politically reactive?
You would like to think so, but like the issue even with the data, so the data is nice to have because if you've got really good data and it's widely available, everybody in theory has the same intelligence base to work off of. But I know, and you'll know from experience, that how people interpret the same data is different. So I might look at these figures and say, well, this is telling us that we need to do this. And somebody else will look at them and say, no, it's telling us we need to do that. But it's the same data, So you can't legislate for that. But what you would hope for is that you might gain more consensus and you might gain more clarity because people are looking at the same thing possibly in the same way. Or at least you have the opportunity for that to occur. If you have a little bit of a data vacuum, or you've got these contests around the data and you're using this form of completion figures and I'm using this form of completion figures, then that's very disruptive, right? Because the base from which you're then arguing for a particular policy intervention, we're really not comparing like with like. We've got different things going on. We've got partial intelligence going on, as well as our own political agenda or commercial agenda or whatever agenda it might be, right? So there are different views about, but I think it makes it more, I guess, transparent around what's actually happening. And part of our problem, I think, in the system at the minute is there are too many bits where we don't have information on them, or if we have them, they're private and they're not open. That's both in the state data. There's state data that's still closed, and there's obviously private data that remains closed. And actually the private entities might gain more value by sharing it. So we've got used to the notion of open source software and companies benefiting from sharing their code and sharing the software they produce. They might well get the same spillover benefits from sharing the data and other anticipated things from doing that, but people are still very defensive around the data. They say it's our intelligence, our competitive advantage. And we haven't really had that conversation. A little bit towards data trusts, where companies will share data within a trust amongst each other, but not externally out. So there might be some role there in industry about maybe sharing data. There might be benefit at the whole, say, housing planning community that might have spillover effects back to them or more intangible effects back to them, but we've not done that. It's probably a conversation that needs to kind of be had. I don't know how likely it is.
Well, I don't think it's unlikely, actually, and that's based on my work with a number of trade organisations. In fact, there are somewhere between 12 and 16 trade bodies operating across the built environment, and we would very much try to bring them together, but actually there's a certain amount of data sharing happens within those. So if we could get them out, so that might be a logical next step. Rob, I hope that it is clear for anybody listening in today how the work that you and your team here within the Geography Department of Maynooth University is contributing to a better policy environment. But how can the industry help you and your team?
I think just being open to these conversations that we're trying to have around the whole data ecosystem and helping us kind of map that out, work out who's got what, work out where the gaps are, work out where the quality issues are and so on, and help us make with suggestions around how we fix that. whether that's blue sky stuff and we need new measures and we need new things, or whether that's actually we already do that, you don't know about it, but we do it, and like we just, maybe you come to us and ask us, or we share the data, or we collaborate with somebody, or whatever it is. So like, so we've been doing quite a lot of that around our interviews. So we've done like 170 odd interviews at this stage, and I'm often saying, you know that company over there has that data. Maybe your company should go and talk to that company, and maybe you can get some strategic partnership where you match up your data with. If you matched up your data with their data, it'd be a really powerful tool. But they actually don't know each other exists.
Yeah.
You know, and so that kind of, we've done a bit of that kind of brokerage kind of work. Now, I don't want to overstate it because it is just one, or it's just a handful of cases. But like, at the minute, we're all fairly disjointed.
Well, that
not
comes
disjointed,
back
we're
to your
all
work.
fairly disconnected, I guess. There's
Does
lots
that
of
come back
actors.
to the importance of actually mapping the data ecosystem across the built environment?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I've asked a lot of people like questions around, what kinds of data sets do you use and so on, and they often talk about the same 15 data sets.
Yeah.
And I say, have you used those data sets or these data sets? And they're just, I didn't really realise, and I didn't like. And it's because they're really difficult to find. Like, if you don't know, you don't know, and nobody's pointing you to them.
Yeah.
So unless you're prepared to go and hunt around. Now, as academics, we tend to hunt around, like, and we would tend to try and assemble those. Now, what we were doing in Aero was we were trying to assemble that data into our tools. So a lot of what we would do with state agencies or companies is we would go in and we would either produce the tools for them, or we would, so an example of that recently, not housing, is the COVID dashboards. The national COVID dashboards were built by Aero across the way. They were getting like the data 3 times a day from all the hospitals and the vaccination centres and whatever, and they were compiling it and putting it back up again, right? So we were building tools, or we were georeferencing the data prior to postcodes. So a lot of times organisations first saw their data mapped was because we geocoded their data for them and then put them in a mapping tool so they could see it, because before that there was no way of mapping the data because it wasn't georeferenced.
Yeah.
So we've been trying to help people with things like the data management, the data strategies or data policies, think about ways in which they could extract value out of the data.
Are you open to outreach from industry?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Okay.
So, anything that would help us get a better handle. Like what we're trying to do is act almost like as a facilitator to help people by identifying the various issues and so on, and then maybe trying to suggest some ways of solving them. That's kind of what we're trying to do,
With the show notes here, we'll certainly share not just the information and link to this and some of your other publications, but also maybe just some images or a clip of the 3D model in action, because I think that really brings to life how the data can jump off of spreadsheets and into how showing impact in people's daily lives.
But
so we'll definitely do that.
To finish on this,
please,
right?
Yeah.
So this book is a key things on space and place. Now that obviously covers housing, planning, built environment, and so on. But there are like key thinkers on. I think there's a book on key urban thinkers, and there's a book maybe on housing. And the key thing to realise is, say, within relation to housing, is again there are different philosophies around thinking about housing. So whether you come at it from a more kind of humanistic perspective or a more structural perspective, like political economy perspective or whatever, and that lens creates a particular way of thinking about that issue. It shapes how you answer questions, and then what you do with the knowledge. Like, it leads to a very different kind of. So whether you think you need to be objective and scientific and distant, or whether you think you need to be more engaged and action, and so it's like whether you study the world or whether you're trying to change the world. Now, for a lot of like business and other people, they think academics should just study the world, and they shouldn't. It's not their job to try and change the world. That's the job of policymakers or whatever, right? But the different philosophy will give you a different way in to doing this, and that sometimes creates the tension between academia and business, or academia and state, is because their philosophical view is quite different about what they think the purpose of knowledge creation is, and the what the purpose of the university is. So that might be. Whereas we're quite pragmatist in that sense. I have a very clear idea of my own philosophical view of the world, but I'm also quite pragmatic about the ways in which I want to try and contribute. So that involves working with. I want to try and change things from the inside, basically, by working with actors to try and shape particularly the kind of the link between data and policy.
And would you, and I'm conscious that we've very much gone over time and we need to wrap up, but I suppose just because you've opened the door to it now, when you talk about the different ideologies, I would very much hold the view that in a housing delivery context, we're probably gone past the stage. I think we're in the stage of triage at the moment where ideologies don't necessarily come into it. I think we need to look at how do we deliver quality, sustainable housing as quickly and affordably as possible.
But that's why you sometimes get the people talking past each other, right? So like the ideological difference of like the solution is the market, the solution is public housing delivered by the state. That's partly an ideological worldview about how you address
But
a problem.
You're taking ideology out of it, is the triage for a real crisis, is the triage situation. We need all types, all tenures, all methods of financing, all is needed quite quickly.
I agree that we definitely need a quick answer to it, and it's just how that's done, basically.
Right.
But your solution to how it's done will come from a.
But do we need to select a solution? Is it a case that actually we're trying lots of different things? We haven't built in tolerance for failure in our housing delivery process at all, and I just wonder if we allowed that, would we actually speed up the learning and the lessons that could be taken from that? So rather than trying to have ideologies fight it out, or even housing typologies fight it out, actually we know that all types and tenures are needed. So we look at how quickly they can be delivered and how quickly can we learn and correct as we go. And maybe that's where the speed is needed.
Yeah, well, we definitely need speed, and we definitely need some of the blockages kind of fixed, because it's not going, it's not working at the minute, as we all know.
Well, look, thank you so much to you and your team within the School of Geography here within Maynooth University for the work that you're doing and contributing to the industry. And I would put a call out to the industry to contribute back and contribute data and contribute information to your team, so that we're actually all working towards a more industry informed and data informed policy. Rob, thank you so much. That was Rob Kitchin, Professor of Geography within the university, or within Maynooth University. My thanks as always to producer Katie Talon and to the Hear Me Roar team on sound. And finally, thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next Placemaking Book Club here on iProperty Radio.